Thank you, everyone, for joining me for the live internet studies. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi. Time for another hour and a half of 2 segments of studies that go back to back. If you listen to the entire study, first segment is entitled Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. We're looking at rapture views. We're talking about the Prewrath rapture view, what it is. Is it plausible? Is it possible? Is it comprehensive? Is it something that should be given a serious audience? We're going to continue looking at this for probably a few more weeks to come, so just stick around if that's a topic you're interested in. The second segment is entitled A Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism, and it's an apologetic work dealing with passages in the Bible that could go one way or the other depending on the perspective that you read the verse in. Some verses have just enough ambiguity that if you stop at that one verse, you could probably make your case either way based on one verse. Well, we're trying to avoid doing that. We're going to jump into a brand new passage tonight in the book of Isaiah again, and I hope you would be able to stick around for that segment as well. All right, let's jump into eschatology. If you look on your screen right now, we're in topic number 11, making a case for the pre-wrath view. Let's describe the other views just real quickly. There are 4 that I'm bouncing off of in this particular segment that I'm going to keep doing through the eschatology studies as well. There's the pre-tribulationism. We'll talk about that in a moment. There's a chart. There's mid-tribulationism, which isn't very popular these days, but I do talk about it anyway. And there's a chart I'll tell you about. There's post-tribulationism. This is extremely popular these days. And then there's their chart. Lastly, there's Prewrath. That's the view that I hold to, and there's the chart. So let's go back real quick, and I'll just describe them for you. I won't take too long. In any given prophetic discussion, there's a final time frame on planet Earth that is popularized by the phrase 7-year tribulation, although I myself don't hold that label. But I do recognize the 7-year time. It's the time when God will bring the history of mankind to a proper consummation before ushering in his own 1,000-year millennial kingdom. So I'm what you label as a premillennialist. I believe that the rapture will happen premillennial. It will happen prior to the millennial kingdom. And I do believe in a literal 1,000-year millennial kingdom. So in relationship to that 7-year time frame, the rapture view, known as pre-tribulation rapture, places the rapture at the very beginning of that 7-year time frame, and it places another monumentous event known as the second coming at the far end, or at the very end of the 7-year tribulation. That's essentially the pre-trib rapture. It gains its name from the fact that everything in the middle is labeled as tribulation / God's wrath, and we Christians are not ordained to wrath, 1 Thessalonians 5:9, and thus the rapture must be pre-tribulation. We must be gone before the tribulation of God is poured out. Remember, the word tribulation and wrath are kind of synonymous terms that are used in these discussions. Moving into the mid-trib view, same 7-year slice of history. Second coming on the far right, but the rapture itself moves into the middle of the week based on some assumptions about the time and assertions about the and interpretations about the timing of the last trump that Paul talks about, the 7th trumpet in the book of Revelation. We're still not destined to God's wrath, so we have to be raptured out of harm's way, in other words, prior to anything happening. But we do go through some tribulation, but not great tribulation. Midpoint of the week is when they place their timing. The third view on my list that we're going to be looking at and continue to look at, it's post-tribulation rapture. This is extremely popular among groups like Catholics, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Orthodox-leaning type denominations, people who are like very kind of structured in their services and liturgies. This is also very popular among Messianics. It's very popular among those who have any affinity with Messianic Judaism. Dr. Michael Brown, Professor Craig Keener, Joel Richardson, pro-Israel groups like that, Dr. Douglas Moo, Pastor John Piper, to name a few prominent post-tribbers that I'm aware of in my camps. They don't all fully agree on what they teach, but they all agree that basically the church is going to see some hard time. And some of them label that God's wrath, like this chart does. Some of them don't. There's some different perspectives. Some believe that we still will be raptured out prior to the wrath being poured out. They just reduced the wrath maybe to 24 hours or a very short period. But we're definitely going to go through the Great Tribulation. And so the post-trib rapture is at the farthest end of this chart. And it's basically, in this version that you're seeing, it is combined with the second coming. So that a signature feature of the post-trib rapture is that there definitely isn't this long 7-year gap between the rapture and the second coming. Basically, the post-trib teaches that the rapture and the second coming are the same event. There's only one event, and they're the same event, and everything happens at the far end. And thus, I've heard post-tribbers throw around the label post-trib pre-wrath. I don't know if that's in an effort to bring them a little more in alignment with the pre-wrath position we're going to look at in a second, the one I hold to, or if, in other words, have they been listening to some pre-wrath teachers and realize that, hey, maybe we shouldn't hold to a view where God shelters us in place through the wrath. Maybe we should take ourselves out of the way before the wrath is poured out, but have us go through the trib itself, the great trib, something like that. But either way, this is one view of the post-trib rapture. Another view has God's wrath shrunk down to the farthest right side right after the rapture into a mere 24 hours, so that the day of the Lord ends up being a literal 24-hour day. But those are the ones that probably call themselves post-trib pre-wrath. And that leads us to the final view, which is actually called the pre-wrath. This is a name that was coined by the fathers of the pre-wrath position about 30 or 40 years ago. I'm talking about Marv Rosenthal and Robert Van Kampen. Prewrath says, when you look at that 7-year slice, let's not even call it the 7-year tribulation. Instead, let's recognize that there are sections that are described by the Bible that help us understand when the tribulation actually is and when the day of the wrath of God, the day of the Lord, actually is. So the main feature of the pre-wrath rapture is those separated segments, right? We got the Great Tribulation, which is a definitive time period. We've got God's wrath, aka the day of the Lord, which is another definitive period. And then we have the pre-wrath rapture separating those two sections. And the second coming is also separated. This is something, again, that many of the other views some have separations between rapture and second coming. Others don't, like post-trib doesn't. But something unique to the pre-wrath view is that the details that you're looking at are essentially a synthesis between the other three views. And so sometimes another view is simply a refutation of a previous view, an existing view. For instance, pre-trib made its splash in, like 150 years ago in name, at least. And then post-trib came out afterwards in refutation, in opposition to pre-trib. Maybe mid-trib might have come along earlier than that, but sometime in the middle. But the point I'm trying to make is, what is pre-trib? It's what post-trib isn't. What is post-trib? It's what pre-trib isn't. In other words, they're kind of just polar opposites. But the pre-wrath position tries to look at the post-trib, tries to look at the pre-trib and says, you guys got a lot of good stuff to say. Let's keep that. We don't need to throw that out. That's good Bible exegesis. That's good theology. It's good interpretation. The pre-wrath also looks at the post-trib and says, you guys got a lot of good stuff too. You guys got some positives. In fact, you cleaned up a lot of the messes that the pre-tribbers were making. You didn't fall for the same mistakes. You corrected those. Yet you overcorrected in some ways. And so the pre-trib tries to come along, pre-wrath comes along and says, how do we synthesize these two great positions, pre and post, into one position that retains the strengths of both positions, but avoids the mistakes and the pitfalls and the weaknesses of those positions? And I think it does a pretty good job. And so that's why I'm trying to be a bit convincing to you in this particular look. But so pre-wrath is the position that we're discussing right now. We left off, we're talking about we're using resources from a gentleman that gave me permission to use his resources exclusively. Everything except the book itself, reading from the book. Brother Aaron Eggman has a website at prewrathresources.wordpress.com. I put a link to it in the description of the video. And right now, we're looking at his post entitled Distinguishing Between the Great Tribulation and the Day of the Lord. So let me change the view like that and jump in where we left off. I'll try to read as much as possible and then go back and explain what I understand to be what Brother Eggman is referring to. Also, since we're in the third week of this now, I think I'll be able to finish this tonight, so it might be a little shorter than an hour. We'll see. All right, let's just jump right in. Let me show you a chart real quick. What Brother Eggman is focusing on right now is when it comes to understanding and appreciating the pre-wrath perspective, a signature feature of the pre-wrath view of the Bible, in case you're not catching it, let me scroll to a chart that I myself created just a few weeks ago. It is, wow, how embarrassing. It is not on this chart. So let me do this real quick for you guys. Let's park it out there. I'm going to open up the chart that I'm looking for. I didn't have it open before, but I will here in a moment. It is right here. Okay, so this is the one we're going to use. Give me a second. Let me slide that tab way over there. Oops, don't want to do that. Nope, there we go. All right, so what you're looking at here is, blow it up a little bit. What you're looking at is a chart that I made a few weeks ago that describes a part of Daniel's 70th week, the part where the rapture kicks in, the far left of your screen, the red arrow. And what I can ascertain using the pre-wrath research of Scripture is that we're talking about Yeshua's parousia, which is one single coming, yet two significant events. I know it's not just a word game where some people say, no, it's two comings, it's two arrivals, it's two second comings, which I'm telling you, the Bible does not give us the permission to describe it as two second comings. The post-tribbers like to accuse the pre-tribbers of saying that there's only one event, but really when they say it's 7-year disconnect between the rapture and the second coming, it just smacks of two and three. It's second coming, two second comings, right? As if Jesus came into the world 3 times. First 2,000 years ago, and then 2 more times in the future. But the pre-wrath, and I've listened to arguments going back and forth on this. Listen, the Bible only describes one single parousia, one single coming or presence of the Lord. The word parousia doesn't even really capture the temporal aspect or the movement, like paroukomai or karmenai or any of the verbs that have in the Greek that use that form of the root word, that describe movement. Parousia doesn't really do that. It just has a sense of the presence of the person as that presence is experienced by any given local region. So Yeshua's presence, Yeshua's parousia, there's only one that's used. It's used in the singular in the New Testament, but for good reason. It's because I believe that the pre-wrath view correctly identifies this one parousia as the day of the Lord, the day of Christ, the wrath of God. It's one event, the day of Yeshua's return. Yet, there are, as far as I can tell, definitive, what do we kind of want to say, itinerary events that are connected with this one single coming that would include enough detail for us to realize that there is Yeshua has a busy schedule once he comes back. The 2 bigger events are the rapture that initiates his coming, and the second coming that kind of more or less consummates his coming, although some people would say that the millennium itself is part of the presence, part of the parousia, which means it's really even 1,000 years long. And there's some room to agree with that as well. Germane to my point, by looking at this graph, I won't wax too long on this, is that the main thing that Brother Eggman right now is focusing on is that there is a differentiation. He's going to be talking about this in a moment. There's a differentiation between the tribulation and the wrath of God. And what we're seeing in front of you right now is the wrath of God, the day of the Lord part of it. You're not seeing the tribulation. The tribulation is in front of the rapture. And we gain this perspective from Yeshua saying immediately after the tribulation of those days. So it means, if language has any meaning in its normal sense, that the coming of the Lord will take place after the rapture of those days. This is Matthew chapter 24, starting at verse 29. Immediately after the rapture of those days, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky. The powers of heavens will be shaken. That's the passage I'm talking about. So Brother Eggman's going to focus on these two different time frames, tribulation versus day of the Lord. But I wanted to kind of zoom in on the day of the Lord part to show you that we're still talking about one event known as the coming of the Lord, which is it comes after the tribulation of those days. It commences sometime after the midpoint of the week, after the Great Tribulation, and after the sixth seal sign. Notice the tags of after and after. God's wrath includes both the trumpets and the bowls, but not the seals. So at the very bottom of my chart teases rapture versus second coming. Is there more than one return of Christ? The pre-wrath rapture harmonizes all relevant data into one working model. So back to Brother Eggman. So at the very least, when you're looking at rapture views, it's helpful to notice what I can't understand is the absolute plain. I can't understand why people don't see the plain sense of the word, other than the fact that we have some equivocation on the phrases tribulation and day of the Lord, tribulation and wrath. And that explains why Prewrath calls themselves Prewrath based on the wrath of God being defined only as the word wrath only referring to the wrath of God, when in reality, the Great Tribulation is the wrath of Satan. But we're not saying that the rapture is post-wrath, as in wrath of Satan post. We're not saying that. Instead, we focus on the day of the Lord, which is the monumentous event described in the Old Testament, the Tanakh, and we say that the rapture takes place prior to that, and therefore we are not destined for God's wrath. Pre-trib, by the way, they equivocate on the word tribulation, whether they realize it or not. But in reality, we have to give them credit for being the original pre-wrathers. What do I mean by that? They label the entire 7 years as the wrath of God, aka the tribulation. Although there is a part of it that they recognize is the Great Tribulation, right? You remember the chart here. So yeah, they've got Great Tribulation. But the point being, in their model, and to their credit, they correctly affirm that the Bible promises that God will not pour out his wrath on his bride, which just makes good theological sense. Meaning, the pre-trib rapture is actually truly a pre-wrath rapture, in the sense that the rapture takes place prior to the wrath of God being poured out. They just don't realize that they equivocate on the word wrath and tribulation and confuse everyone. They confuse themselves without realizing it by looking at verses when Yeshua says immediately after the tribulation of those days. And whereas a pre-wrather and a post-tribber would see Matthew 24:29 as describing the rapture event, the pre-tribbers have to force Matthew 24:29 into a second coming event, because they say immediately after the tribulation. They're like, oh, that must be the end of the 7 years. I'm like, no, only if you equivocate on the word tribulation and read it as wrath. You guys don't know what I'm talking about. Let me show you the verse. Give me a second. This is worth stopping and slowing down for a split second before I jump into Brother Eggman. Okay, here we have the famous Matthew 24:29. What does Jesus say? But immediately after the tribulation of those days. And then he describes this cosmic event, this cosmic disturbance sign, which everyone in the world will see. If it can be ascertained that the coming of the Son of Man mentioned in the very next two verses, verse 30 is the coming of the Son of Man, and verse 31 is the gathering of the elect. If we look at these three verses, 29, 30, and 31 of Matthew 24, and take them as a unit, and we have Yeshua giving us a chronological marker, a sequence marker of immediately after the tribulation of those days. And this tribulation, by the way, is identified as Great Tribulation just a few verses earlier in verse, where is it? Verse 21 right here, For then there will be a great tribulation, and this is like a megale thlipsis in the Greek or something like that. Megale is great, tribulation is thlipsis. This phrase, by the way, megale thlipsis, great tribulation, is only used 3 times in the entire New Testament, and all 3 times it's used by Yeshua. Once here in Matthew, and I think it's used twice again in Revelation. But either way, the point is it's used by Yeshua. And it's always describing the same event, this event that everyone kind of realizes is connected to the 70th week, but most of us located in this last half of the 70th week. So going back down to verses 29, 30, and 31, he says immediately after the tribulation. At its normative reading, tribulation means the time of great tribulation, right, connected to the immediate antecedent earlier. And it means that those days when persecution will befall the elect of God. Who is the elect? Could be Israel, could be the church. I take it to be both to some degree, as there's this overlapping of the 2 ecclesiological groups of God for a moment. I am not a dispensationalist, so I have no need to remove the church from the 70th week of Daniel like pre-tribbers do. But germane to my point is that Yeshua says immediately after. And yes, I know there's some disagreement on even on the word after, right? Let's do whatever we can to turn Yeshua's words into not meaning what they say. But if we take it at face value, after the tribulation of those days, the coming of the Son of Man will occur and the gathering together of the elect will occur. So going back to the chart, going back to these charts that we use, if tribulation means wrath, then the description of something happening immediately, the coming and the gathering happening immediately after tribulation, according to pre-tribbers, must be the second coming, because they think the word tribulation that Yeshua used, thlipsis, in that verse, is God's wrath. I disagree with them. I, in fact, think that the post-tribbers, like the pre-wrathers, have the better interpretation. Great tribulation is something that is leveled at Christians and Jews, just like post-tribbers teach, just like we pre-wrathers teach. And therefore, when he says immediately after the tribulation, he's talking about a rapture event and a gathering together of the elect that takes place, just like it says, after the tribulation, which in this chart is also the wrath of God. But remember, not all post-tribbers have that same perspective. Here's a post-trib view that puts wrath of God, shortens it a bit, rapture still after the wrath there, meaning after the tribulation or after the wrath of God. But look what happens in this chart. We have the day of the Lord on the other side of the rapture, which doesn't even agree with the previous 2 charts I just showed. But what it does do, at least, is it puts the rapture before the day of the Lord. So there are 3 events that kind of go sequentially, follow from one another as far as I can tell. In reading in the order, they would be tribulation, then rapture, then wrath. Or tribulation, then rapture, then day of the Lord. That's the order that I know them to be in, so I'll park out there so you can see. So this is what Brother Eggman is going to be highlighting. Tribulation, then wrath, then God. Oh, I'm sorry, let's try that one more time. Tribulation, then rapture, then God's wrath. So let's go over to his post and pick that up. Here's where we left off last week. This is the previous paragraph backed up just so you can get the running start. The transition from the 5th seal, the Great Tribulation, to the 6th seal, which precedes the day of the Lord, is evident in how the people of the earth respond to the 6th seal. When the signs appear in the sky, every person on the face of the earth sees Jesus come and flees from him in terror. Excuse me. So we're referencing Matthew 24:30 as well as Revelation 6:12-17. He goes on to say that the 6th seal portrays the people of earth fleeing for the mountains and hiding in caves, crying out to the mountains and the rocks, quote, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb," end quote. That is from Revelation 6:15, a verse that I maintain is a very strong indicator that the wrath of God has not commenced until this point in time. Why would they be acting the way they're acting and saying what they're saying if the wrath of God had been going on for 6 seals up to this point? So the pre-tribbers have a very weak argument when they try to describe that the wrath of God has already been going on since the first seal was cracked open by Yeshua. But let's keep reading. Brother Eggman says, in this way, the 6th seal is the first time the book of Revelation declares the day of the Lord has begun. Indeed, as I insert my own commentary, The word wrath here in the book of Revelation, which has two different Greek words, maybe even three that it uses. One of those Greek words, that's translated into wrath in English. One of those Greek words it's the first time it shows up in the book of Revelation in this particular verse where wrath shows up, which I believe is also indicative of the fact that wrath is just now happening with the seventh seal. The wrath of God will commence. The seals themselves are preconditions that must take place prior to the wrath of God or the day of the Lord. Let me put it another way that might be easier for you to see, or easy for you to understand. I'm going to show you a different chart. If we look at this particular chart of the 7-year time frame, and you notice the seals running down the bottom, 1 through 6, and then if you jump back up to the midpoint, the middle section of this graph, and look at that yellow section, Day of the Lord, 7th seal, trumpets plus bowls. That yellow section is essentially the scroll that occupies the bulk of the dialogue of the narrative and the prophecy in the book of Revelation itself. There's this scroll, I'll put this in post-production for you to see it even better. There's this scroll in the hand of God the Father seated on the throne as John's seeing this vision in heaven. And on the outside of the scroll, there are 7 seals, indicating that the contents are hidden from access by all except someone who has access to the scroll. Namely, obviously God has access to the scroll. He wrote it. It represents more or less the title deed to planet Earth. And therefore, whoever can open this scroll owns the earth. That's kind of what's what I take what's going on. This 7-sealed scroll is only accessible by someone who's worthy, and it turns out to be that Yeshua, the Lamb, who was slain. John sees him. He's the one that's worthy to open the scroll. But in order to open the scroll, he has to open all 7 seals together. He can't open one and then access the scroll. The way that they're sealed on the outside and running along the seam, they all have to be cracked open before access to the scroll can take place. So the scroll represents the title deed to planet Earth, but it more importantly also represents the wrath of God against he who would try to usurp that authority, he who would try to thwart God's plan in giving this title deed to the one who's worthy. Namely, God already promised to give this to his son, Yeshua. Ask of me and I will give thee the nations, God said in the book of Psalms. This is Psalm chapter 2, I believe. And so, or it might be Psalm 110. I always get those two conflated with one another with the details that are in the Psalms. The point being is that in this scroll, it's represented by the 7 seals on the outside. It's the day of the Lord that is going to be unleashed against the wicked kingdom who has already usurped the authority, right? Way back in the garden, Satan took control of that which really was man's domain that God gave to man to watch over, namely the earth. And yet Satan stole that from him, or man relinquished the rights to it, and both of them failing together there. And thus, the earth has been under the power of the evil one ever since then. But one day Jesus will return to reclaim his rightful place on the throne and reclaim control over the earth, which belongs to him anyway. So this scroll represents this drama of giving the earth back to its rightful owner, which is Christ himself.